Okay, so just a quick review first. So in the EP, our coastal or maritime creation, which I divide up by the ketoves rather than the Erev and Boker each day. And we'll get just a quick review to give us that justification. So the first step was just to stick light into all this darkness, wind, and water. And then if you'll notice, called night, that ellipsis is evening and morning one day, day one. So that matches. But then the next step, which I have as being the dividing of the waters, and we'll see what happens with that. This ellipsis down here in verse 8 is evening and morning, day two.
When you're talking ellipsis, you mean,
3 dots.
okay, I didn't realize that's what it was called. Thank you.
The missing material.
Okay.
So the rakia is created on day two, separating water above from water below. But if we read it by the days, then the creation of the rakia was in and of itself a step in creation. However, if we read it by the tovs, it's not the creation of the rakia that's important, it's separating the waters out into distinct areas. And so day two ends with the rakia, but the waters have not finished being separated until the first half of day three, when we saw the land appear to separate the waters further that were below. So that's my statement of steps, is the waters are separated above and below, and then the waters below are further separated into seas and dry land. And then we get a ketov. But remember, this is now day three. Day two had no ketov.
So I'm trying to look at three. So there's the sky. I mean, what's the third highest level?
Well,
There's
that's going to
the
be this,
water, the land, and what's on top?
the sky. That
But
that is water below and water above were separated here in verses 6 through 8, and the water above was called sky.
okay, so it really wasn't water, it was sky.
Well, but it's water.
Moisture. There's moisture.
No, it's a dome that holds the water up.
Okay.
If you look at the sky, it looks like just a big blue surface. And every now and then the blue surface gets choppy with water things, clouds. And if you look at the water below, it's a big blue surface that sometimes gets choppy with waves and foam.
Okay.
So the waters have been separated, but the water above now is in a sense done. It's going to be called that blue canopy over us, that blue membrane that holds the water up is the heavens, the shamayim, the sky. And then day three, the waters below get further separated out, being given a container. And the container for the water below is land. And then we get the container is called Eretz, and the water is called Yamim, oceans or seas. So that was where we left off last time. We move then to this week. The land now has its own creation. That is, the land formed first to be a container of the water, and then the land is dealt with separately and it becomes the container for vegetation. So that was what we read today. And again, it's divine fiat. God says there will be, and we find out vayihichen, and it was. So God says there will be land with grasses and trees, and the trees give fruit, and the fruit comes each in its own kind. So when you have an apple tree, you're never going to get a peach on it. Plum tree won't create apricots.
That's, yeah, but it does.
Well, it does now because we've monkeyed with creation. But in the natural state that God created, and how far back was grafting and other kinds of changes, certainly is not in the purview of the biblical audience and author.
But I bet they did it very quickly.
But you stick an acorn in the ground, you get an oak tree, it's not going to be an elm.
Plant a carrot, get a carrot, never
right.
any doubt.
Put a loaf of bread in the ground and you get breadfruit. So that's done. Then step 4 is we're up in the heavens again, in the Shamayim, and in the Shamayim, remember, up until this point, there was just light all around. And the light goes away and it gets dark. And that was day and night. Now, the light that's up in the heaven is going to be localized into individual points. Or one could say the light now will have light inhabitants in the sky. So there'll be a host of lights in the heavens. And when we get done with all of this, we're going to look at the parallelism between the opening 3 steps of creation and the closing 3 steps of creation. That is 1, 2, 3 verses 4, 5, 6.
Now, just one thought. I'm trying to, when you go to the classes and you start taking it apart, there was a differentiation between the initial light and this light. The
Yes.
initial light was like the light of consciousness and light of it had a more spiritual bent, the initial light.
Well, it has, by later commentary, a more spiritual bent. But by practical, if you think about a cloudy day, there's light, but no localized point of origin of that light. It's just an all-pervasive light. Or if you think about a cloudy night, the moon is full, but you can't see it. All you see is light clouds. So later, yes, we're going to get lots of commentaries about the different lights and what they are, and the first light. But I think from the biblical imagination, it's just light.
I guess it still seems one is darkness and one is light. This one is day and night. It just seems that there's a different level of existence. I don't know. It just seems different to me.
Well, again, if you're thinking, I think if you're thinking of a maritime culture, there's light all around, even if you don't see the sun or the moon or the stars. And there's pervasive light. A cloudy day is much lighter than a cloudy night. At night, if you can't see the moon or the stars, there's very little light. It's basically darkness, especially if it's a night when there's no full moon. So you go out on a cloudy night go to the beach on a cloudy night at midnight, and it's pretty much just dark. Go away from city lights, go away from ambient human-made light, just go out into a totally lightless, human-generated lightless night when there's no moon and there are clouds covering the sky. And you're basically in dark. Go to that same beach in the morning or at noon when the clouds are still all around, and now it's light, and the light is all around. Again, there's no local a source of that light. That's the first day of creation. And God says, at noon, from now on, there will be light, and that's midday. And at 12 a.m., there's dark all around, and that's midnight. And I'm going to separate the light time, the midday time, from the nighttime, and they will alternate with each other. So again, this is later a spiritual, whether or not it was spiritual at the time or whether it was a more practical maritime story. We're putting the boats out on a cloudy night with no moon. It's right before new moon time or around new moon time, and it's just dark. But 12 hours later, it's just light. And so that dark period we're going to call night, and that light period we're going to call day. And that was step one. Now the clouds have parted in step 4. And the light now has localized either sources or localized inhabitants of the light, or quantums of light, individuals of light, a host of lights, a population of lights. And those lights, which are called me'orot, as opposed to or, which is light, me'orot are vessels of light, or vehicles of light, or populations of light, lightnesses. And they will be up there, and they will have a job. And that's what we get in verse 14. Verse 14, we get the jobs of the different lights. And some of the lights tell us whether it's day or night. Guess which lights those are?
The sun and the moon?
Exactly. And some of the lights will be signs to let us know what seasons they are. And that becomes the constellations.
Mhm.
My winter buddy, because I did winter sky viewing with my 6th grade class in elementary school. We went to a very dark area behind the school. We ground our own 6-inch reflector mirror and made our own telescope. And we went, and of course, the winter was a much better time for stargazing because they come out a lot earlier. Maybe colder, but they're earlier. So my favorite constellation was the one you can see in the winter, which is Orion. And when Orion's up, you know it's winter. So that was the sign of the signs and the seasons. And then the sun tells us days, and the sun tells us years, or the constellation tells us years. When Orion returns, it's another year. So we get the lights actually, again, for a maritime community. Those lights at night and day, those lights in the sky, help us navigate and help us know what season it is. Is it hurricane season? Is it freezing season? Is it spawning season? And we know that by looking up. And then verse 16, God makes 2 big lights, and they are the same size, but one of them is the great light and one of them is the lesser light. And the great light is in charge of the day, and the lesser light is in charge of the night, and it gets attendants, which are the stars. So that's verse 16. And God puts them up there and gets it all done and finishes it. And verse 18, Tov, it's Ki Tov. So the lightnings, the lightings, the lightnesses, the things that populate the heavens that are individual lights, they're done, and we're done with step 4. You have to wait till next week for step 5. So that's, again, whether you go by day and night, evening, morning, or whether you go by ketovs, that's specifically stated individual stages. The why story is much more complicated, thus the Hebrew is more complicated.
Mhm.
And going back to where we were last week, we started with the creation of watering the desert. So now we have things can grow, but they don't grow for any purpose that humans are aware of unless there's a human to deal with them. So step 2 was then to create the human. And that was a gathering of the Adamah, the earth, the clay, the dust, forming it into an Adam, giving it a breath, CPR, breathing into it life, and having a garden. And God makes the garden. By the time this story has been told, various ways of domesticating plants have been around for a long time. So where did the first domesticated plant come from? It's lost in human history by the time this story is being told. So this story is not being told by the first farmers or the first shepherds. It's being told by the shepherds who have awareness of some kind of organized plant life, not just weeds. Who made organized plant life? Oh, God. And that's this story. God creates organized plant life for human habitation and puts us there to habitate, to inhabit the now God-made ground of organized plants. So that was step 2.
I have a question here. So in the EP story, you've got light, and then on the Y story, you've got mist to irrigate. And I guess I'm looking for parallels. And in the EP story for 2, you've got the separations of the water, and
Okay, so
Yeah.
there aren't direct parallels because they're being told by two peoples with two very different viewpoints of what the world is all about. So the EP story is the story from the standpoint of a mariner, a coastal, a seacoast people, starting with what they consider to be the worst of all possible situations, wind, water, and dark. And by various steps, imposing order onto that chaos. So the steps of what is order from a maritime view would not be the same as the steps of order by an inland peoples.
oh, so there's there's not really a comparison. You've just sort of divided these into 6.
Right. The comparison is that I find that there are indicators that there are actually 6 steps, even in the Y story, even though they're not specifically stated.
I see.
And the other parallel is in both stories, we have a creator God who works with a sense of purpose rather than with a haphazardness of the surrounding mythologies of the gods.
Okay.
So they both work from chaos to order by defined steps.
Okay.
There's not a parallel of what those steps are, however, because they're coming at it from two very different points of view. In the EP story, there's too much water. In the Y story, there's not enough water. So we have to move from too much water to organization. In the Y story, we have to move from not enough water to civilization. So you won't find a parallel between the ones and the Roman numerals to each other, but you will find a parallel in the way in which they take one simple next step.
Okay. And what's the Hebrew word for dryness?
Yabasha.
Yeah.
So if you look up here, Vayomer Elohim yikavu hamayim mitachat hashamayim el makom echad v'teira'eh hayabasha, and will appear a yabasha, a dryness. And God said it, and it was. And then Vayikra Elohim leyabasha, God calls to the yabasha, to the dryness, and says, Eretz, and lemikveh hamayim, the gathering of the waters, Karayamim calls seas or oceans. And that's what a mikveh is. It's a mikveh mayim, a gathering of waters. So that was last week. Those were the first two steps. Step 3, as we saw then, was on the EP side, was the finishing up the land, making it a habitable land, and then getting to work on the heavens. Not parallel to 3 here, but parallel to the next step in the process is after God makes the garden and puts the human in the garden, God makes the garden edible fruits, edible plants. So we now have not only domesticated our wild crab apples, we've turned them into baking apples. But we haven't done that. God did it for us. So God still creates. And God puts into this garden 2 very special trees. God puts in an Eitz Chaim, a tree of life, and an Eitz Dat Tov Ra, a tree of knowing Tov and Ra, good and bad. The addendum material is, again, that's all you needed for the step. That's all you need to know. However, the story goes on and says, and while God was at it, God made a river flow out of this Eden place, which, by the way, if you'll recall from last week, the garden was actually in Eden from the east, that is, east of Eden. It was not a garden of Eden, it was a garden east of Eden. And God then takes that Eden place, whatever it is, and sends a river out from Eden to irrigate the garden. So the river starts in Eden and flows through the garden that God has created with edible fruit trees.
So there are 2 different places.
Yes, the garden is east of Eden.
I kind of always grew up thinking the garden was in Eden. Isn't that
Of course,
interesting?
because that was what you were told when it was called the Garden of Eden.
Yeah.
But in the text, it's not actually called the Garden of Eden, it's the garden east of Eden.
Interesting.
And what is Eden? Eden is the source of all rivers. And we further get that, again, if you don't read the text as closely as we do, you end up with stories from the text that are not always exactly accurate.
But why in 4 does it say the Garden of Eden? Is it because the Eden created that garden?
In 4,
Down below, down
in the
below.
garden, yes. And then it's the garden, then all of a sudden it's the garden Be'eden, the Gan Eden. In the Hebrew, Ta'adam vayinachehu began Eden, in the Garden of Eden. And that's
So,
what people focus on when they tell the stories. They call it the Garden of Eden, forgetting that prior to that it was called the Garden East of Eden, and the garden that the river from Eden flows through. So the Gan
so
Eden,
basically, it's the Garden of Eden, but it technically is the garden created by Eden.
or the garden created east of Eden, on the outskirts of Eden.
Yeah.
Yes. And the river flows out from Eden and it irrigates the garden. And when the river goes through Eden, it then separates out into, in Hebrew, it's called Arba'a Rashim, 4 heads, or 4 beginnings. So and Yipared is to separate. So we have this vision that we have the garden, we have people, a person tending the garden, and the garden now is actually working, creating fruit trees, food trees, and a river is flowing into the garden from some place to the west, from Eden. And when the river flows through Eden, it then separates out into 4 separate entities.
I'm seeing it slightly different. It looks like the river goes from Eden
Yes,
to the garden, and once it's in the garden, then it separates.
exactly.
So it doesn't separate at Eden, it separates in the garden.
Correct.
Okay.
Yes. At the garden, the river from Eden separates out into 4 branches,
I got it. Okay.
or 4 headwaters, or 4 beginnings of new rivers. So now we're going to find out what those rivers are. And the first river is called the Pishon. And where is the river Pishon? It's the river that goes around the land of Havilah where you find gold. And so there are those who have tried to identify which river is which. But that's all they needed to tell us was it was the river Pishon, which would have been known to the biblical audience and author probably, because they knew that gold came from someplace. And gold, if you're living on the Mediterranean, gold comes from some eastern land. And the Pishon River is the one that is in the Havilah, wherever that is. And that's good gold. It's not bad gold. I don't know how you can have bad gold, except that the gold could be used for bad purposes. But we're told that was good gold. Maybe some of the gold was more impure than other gold. But the author needs to tell us that was the good gold place. They also have Bdolach and the stone of Socham.
What is Bedolach?
So these are semi-precious stones. Go to some translations, they'll tell you. I don't know if that was what the biblical author knew. And the second river that goes out is called the Gihon. And this is the Gihon is the one that goes around the land of Cush. Cush, modern scholars think probably was what the area now we think of as Ethiopia. And so therefore the Cush would have ended up being the Nile. What's interesting to this story is that the Cush is not in Mitzrayim. It's rather Gihon is not in Mitzrayim. Gihon circles around the land of Cush. The third one is called Chidelek, and it's the river that's east of Ashur. Ashur was the biblical recognition of Assyria. So the eastern river of Assyria is the Tigris. And the fourth river is called the Frat, and we're not told where it is. But the Frat is usually considered to be Euphrates, which is the western river of the two Fertile Crescent rivers. So probably the biblical author doesn't need to identify Frat, because everybody, in fact, knows that, because they're all Arameans. They come from the Frat side of the Fertile Crescent. But the eastern river of the Fertile Crescent was the Chidelek. All of that is addendum material. We didn't really need it for the story, because the next thing after God creating the food trees and the tree of life and the tree of knowing good and evil will be step 4, is God takes the Adam, God takes this earthling, this human, and rests it, settles it, plants it into the garden, and the job is to work the garden and to guard or keep the garden. And God says to this garden worker, any tree that grows in the garden you are free to eat. So apparently there's no hemlock in the garden east of Eden. There's no deadly nightshade, just tomatoes. Everything you can eat except the tree of knowing good and bad, the Eitz Dat Tov V'Ra, you will not eat, because on the very day that you eat from it, you will die. And again, the Hebrew is Ume'etz Hadat Tov V'Ra, the tree of knowing Tov and Ra, Lo Tochal, you will not eat, Mimenu, from it, Ki Biyom Achalcha Mimenu Mot Tamut, on the day that of your eating from it, dying you will die. Whatever that means. That is step 4.
Rabbi Sam, I have a question or maybe a comment, because when I read the English, the why story, it seemed very familiar in terms of maybe fairy tales being based on this. Oh, here's this lovely place with pleasant trees and fruit and gold and, rivers, and it's all happy, happy. And then when you get to the last line, it says, do not eat this or you will die. It seemed almost Disney-like, in terms of poison apples, in terms of, I don't know, it's kind of a bait and switch, which some fairy tales are, in order to create a little bit of suspense. So I just felt a very fairy tale-like nature to it, which I don't know if anyone else has ever noticed, at least in these two sections.
Yeah, I mean, the fairy tales also are, in a sense, mythologies that try to explain different things or teach different lessons. Again, remembering that this is probably the narrative creation story, therefore would have more story elements to it than the first creation story, which is more of the often seen as the poetic creation story, which would have simply the bare directions. This is the creation story of the inland people who are dealing with a different approach to life, a different society that they are in, trying to explain that society. Perhaps, again, this is a creation story that gives a purposeful God rather than a capricious group of gods, whereas creation story number 1 is also a purposeful God, but much more practical. the
Mhm.
maritime society, the coastal society would have more
Right.
dealing with practical issues rather than
Mhm.
mythological fairy tale issues.
Right. And at the same time, though, I mean, both are stories of making the world more orderly and hospitable for humans.
Exactly.
And I thought also about, if, I mean, God is very powerful in both of these stories, making the world good.
God speaks and it happens. Yeah, God doesn't
Yes.
even have to use God's
Um,
hands.
right. It almost feels like it's kind of telling us if you have the power to do good, you should do it.
Yes, do it with a divine purpose or a good purpose or holy purpose. And hold on
Mhm.
to that fairy tale imagery, because once we get after chapter 2 and do the creation, we have chapters 3 and 4, which have no parallel in the EP story. One of them is the story of Adam and Eve and the serpent, and the other is the story of Cain and Abel, which probably will also feel much more fairy tale like. And there's no parallel. Chapter 1, when we finish creating people, now we have to have offspring, chapter 5. Whereas chapter 2, 3, and 4 is create people, tell a nice little legendary story of Adam and Eve, and pick up on this whole tree of knowing good and evil, which you're right, it has that teaser because we're going to get a whole chapter just about that one tree. Notice, by the way, there was another tree planted that was also special. That was the Eitz Chaim, the tree of life. And nothing is said about eating from the tree of life. We're not told that it was a nourishing tree, a tree that was good to eat, that was good to look at. And we're not told that it was a forbidden tree. So what's up with the Eitz Chaim, the tree of life? It's in the story, and suddenly it's not in the story. How did it get there, and what happened to it? There are a number of possibilities, of course. One is that there was, in fact, a story, but it wasn't considered important enough by the editor-redactor to include in the final edition. Sort of like you've got a glass slipper that only fits 1 foot in the entire kingdom. What's up with that? Besides, that glass slipper is a bad translation of the original story anyway. So what's up with this? Another thought, of course, is that it's there, but it can't get used because they get banished before they can eat from it. The rabbis use all of these kinds of things, material that we think should have been there but isn't, or material that is there that doesn't seem to have any purpose, and they get midrash.
But we know we sing Eitz Chaim He, right? I mean, I'm not sure exactly of the translation, but I know what Eitz Chaim means. So somewhere it must become important.
Well, so the Torah is called an Eitz Chaim. The Torah is a tree of life.
I
So when we
see.
say Eitz
Okay.
Chaim E, what we're saying is it is a tree of life.
Okay.
And so therefore, one midrash you can make from this is God planted 2 trees, a tree of knowing good and bad, and a tree of Torah, a Torah tree.
Hmm.
So the tree of knowing right and wrong, good and bad, whatever, is balanced by the tree of Torah, which teaches us how to choose the good side. So we eat from the tree of knowing good and bad, and now we understand choices and consequences.
Mhm.
And we don't eat from the tree of Torah Rather, we have the tree of Torah always there to eat from.
Gotcha.
And so we eat from Torah. We
It
consume,
it nourishes us, I guess.
exactly, we consume information, we consume the ability to live appropriately with the Eitz Chaim, the tree of life, which is always there from us. And so when we're banished at the end of the story, spoiler alert, we're banished and we're not allowed to go back to the tree of knowing good and bad ever again. But the story doesn't say it, but we could midrash, but we take the tree of Eitz Chaim, the tree of life, with us from everywhere we go from then on. And that gets back to Mona's spiritual translation of this text, is we eat from the trees that produce fruit for the body, and we consume from the Eitz Chaim for the spirit.
Hmm.
Steps 3 and 4 are done. Next week,
There
step
is
5
class?
and 6.
There is
We will-
class?
yes, yeah, we will be, enough people were going to be around. July 4th is the middle of the week, so enough people are going to be around. For some, probably this is the July 4th weekend. For some, next is the July 4th weekend. For some, probably both are July 4th weekends. So we will still, and in the tech, in it, it does say July 6th. So there is a group of materials. And when we get to steps 5 and 6, we have reading material, we have basic examining material, and we have a whole addendum material.
Sounds good.